Well, good morning, everybody. Tuesday morning time for some thoughts of mine on the discussion forum and the stuff from the weekend. Just noticed that I'm repping like the Great White North here really heavily today. Got my University of Windsor sweater, which was a gift from a friend of mine, one of my master's degrees. And I got my Tim Hortons cup going here, so a lot of inside baseball Canadian jokes for you this morning. Just wanted to point out, after going through the discussion forums, I thought we're in a good place. I think a lot of you had some really interesting observations, right? So Adam, I thought, had this really important point about how the influence of smaller powers are starting to shape the sort of norms and processes of the international system. And I thought that was really great. And what made Adam's point really effective is that he really went to this discussion about how it's not necessarily the showdown between great powers, between Russia and the United States and China, that's completely shaping how the war in Ukraine and the international response to it is shaping up, but actually like smaller states like Finland, Poland, that the influence that these states have is really important. And the precise way in which these politics are unfolding are really tied up with those states' actions. And I thought that was really interesting. But and then Pablo had this really important point about like, well, what should we actually expect out of the international system? And I thought that was really great, right? Because earlier on in the term, we really made a big deal of that, right? About how even though our ambitions or our goals or our needs from the international system might be really big and elaborate, the system itself may not realistically be able to provide for them, right? So that we have to have a different frame of reference. And I thought that was really great, right? That it really brings up this question, and I think it's an open question, about how do we interpret something like Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Obviously, the international system didn't deter that invasion, but maybe that wasn't possible. But maybe the international system is actually creating a circumstance where even though things are really tense right now, because there are institutions, because there are trade dynamics, and because there are great power balances, we're not seeing an escalation, right? I thought that was a really great point. But there were two things I wanted to bring out, right? One is like, how do we think about designing effects in the system and consolidating power? Not just what's necessary, but like how we might be able to go about creating those circumstances. And that was something that I really didn't see a whole lot of. I also didn't really see a lot of about how we can sort of think about shaping processes and institutions in order to produce outcomes, right? And this was my main, I don't want to say criticism, that's the wrong word. Everybody's developing nicely in the class, but we are at a kind of transition point, right? Where I think a lot of you, and I have faith in everyone's ability to do this because I've been reading your discussion forum posts so closely over the last few weeks, of really starting to give some sort of specifics and some processes and some details here, right? When I was reading the forum, I got a lot of people's posts that really read like, well, we need smaller powers to think the system is legitimate, and we need that so that we can manage these problems that we have in the system right now. Or in order for the economic system to be legitimate, it needs to sort of develop and understand the needs of these smaller states. That's great, but thinking all the way back to our first discussion about globalization, you're in a position now that you have tools that you can go beyond that. You can keep going. You can think about not just, well, what's the problem and how do sort of older ideas of great power politics, right? You have a set of tools for actually thinking about what specifically that is, right? Does that mean the United States actively tries to solidify its balancing against Russia and China, right? Things like expanding NATO, things like the AUKUS agreement in Southeast Asia. Or is it we need to really focus on institutions, right? Do we need to think about, well, making the World Bank more legitimate and thinking about how to establish new criteria for that, right? Or are there the norms? Do we have to engage in particular kinds of processes, right, that would allow us to facilitate this kind of development? You have those tools now, right? So I really hope that as we go down the stretch, right, as we go down the last few weeks of the class, you start to inhabit that space of the analyst, right? Which is, I mean, you've gotten all the work out of the way, you read the theories, right? You've read most of the conceptual material. This week, we're going to add to that looking at regional organizations. But I really want you to inhabit that space where it's up to you to not just think about what's wrong, but actually how to do it, right? How would we arrange these processes? Now, Bear in mind, when we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis and we talked about the liberal international order, one of the main takeaways from that, right, was you all observed that the system itself is heavily shaped state behavior, but it doesn't determine it. That you know, the United States, to borrow a phrase, lives in a world, controls its fate, but not in a world of its own making, right? So thinking about power, thinking about the potential incentive structures of institutions or norms or the balance of power, how do we bring those together? What does it look like? Thinking a little bit more about how you would design that system and using the theories and concepts as a foundation to do that, right? So your unique argument built on those things. In order to sharpen that a little bit, I'll just point out that Haas is going to do that, right? Down the second half of the book, which we start reading in earnest at this point in the class. He's going to make this argument for World Order 2.0, right? Where we develop what basically amounts to a set of norms and expectations that we set the tone for as the great power. And you'll see that his argument is, well, this is how we're going to leverage institutions. This is how we're going to use our power. And he actually makes an argument, well, we can set the tone because if we do, states accept it, ours will be more attractive than what's being offered by Russia or China. Those alternative norms or arguments will be less attractive, right? And he has economic, social, and political arguments for that. So when you're reading that, I want you to put those two things together. And I have every faith that you're all going to have these really interesting observations because you're really strong points in the discussion forums so far this year. Okay, last thing. I hope to get your papers graded by tomorrow, even sooner if I can manage it. Remember, if you haven't read the course information module, you're allowed to revise papers for me, okay? So I'm going to give you feedback. I'm going to try to give you positive and critical feedback. Please don't take the critical feedback negatively. Remember, this is academia. My job is to try to make every argument better, right? Every argument, okay? And then if you want to mount a revision, realize that you can contact me. We can walk through things and we can facilitate that, right? So other than that, I hope you have a great day. Look forward to my lecture for tomorrow and think about sort of what it's going to mean for the next few weeks for you to think about these things as an analyst rather than just an observer. All right?